Immediately upon taking delivery, he does what anybody in the 80s would do. He filled it with drugs and he drove to Vegas. So every day I'm searching around the internet trying to find interesting cars to buy, always open to buying a whole lot of cars, but one car that I'd never personally been necessarily seeking out was an AMG Hammer. But last week I got a call from Ryan from the MB Market and told me that they were listing a car that he actually wanted to come and talk to me about. And he called it the Cocaine Hammer. And I said, well, I like everything about that. Now, hammers are phenomenally rare and exceptionally misunderstood, and as best the records indicate, there are only 13 North American hammers. Now, there's not a consummate VIN list. They haven't canonized the rarity of these cars. There's 30 or so worldwide, but they don't come up for auction very often, and in fact, this was going to be the first public sale since the values have changed radically. Now, I've had several people come on and tell AMG pre-merger stories, and some of them have been about hammers, some have been about the way they modified cars, and most of the cars, in fact, all the hammers were built in Westmont, Illinois at AMG Chicago. And of course, a proper hammer has to be a 300 CE that's converted with an M117 4-cam 6-liter engine. Now, they came in coupes, came in sedans, there's one manual car, there's a handful of different colors, but again, there were only 13 real cars. Now, you'll hear things called hammers that have the later version of the M119, you'll hear them that are actually wide bodies with a 6-liter, you'll hear some that are just AMG cars. People believe they are hammers, but these legendary cars that dominated magazine tests that we saw just beating the world, including the supercars, the hypercars even of the day, these were faster and they were more expensive. And so, as Ryan explained this car to me, he actually told me the story. And I would say it's without question the best hammer story. And in that regard, I would actually say it's the best 80s supercar story that I've ever heard. And that is primarily because the second owner of this car, after less than 24 hours from its original sale date to the original owner, was the DEA. And they in fact drove it a whole lot further than that original owner was. So after the car was built at AMG Chicago in Westmont, Illinois, it was shipped to Beverly Hills Motoring, Andy Cohen's shop, and he was a huge AMG retailer. He did some of the modification, but also just threw on tons and tons of accessories. So when you bought an AMG in Newport Beach, it might come with $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 worth of add-on stuff, sheepskin seat covers, all this mess. And so whatever, it was as 80s as you could possibly be. And of course, this has the monoblock AMG chrome wheels, it's a coupe, it's black, it's quintessential hammer. And immediately upon taking delivery, he does what anybody in the 80s would do. He filled it with drugs and he drove to Vegas. And so he's out blasting through the desert, as we've done many, many times, and apparently along the way, he drew the attention of some law enforcement. So he was being tailed by multiple police officers most of the way to Vegas, but he was going so fast in the fastest car of the day. Again, this was faster than a Countach, faster than a Testarossa, and it was filled with all the accoutrement you might imagine of an 80s hammer. Eventually, he gets to his destination and stops. And a few minutes later, the cops catch up. They arrest him. Obviously, they search the car, they find some coke, they find some Quaaludes, they find all the drugs, and they take possession and ownership of the car. Now, they've got it for quite some time, and eventually, after driving it over 1,500 miles, they auction the car off, and it's purchased by professional baseball player Rob Deere. And in fact, he'd been in contact with the guy they were selling this hammer for, at one point interested in maybe getting it back. So after he owns it for a while, loves the idea of having the ultimate 80s car, he trades the car back in at Symbolic in San Diego. Now, the current seller, I guess being a consummate car guy slash occasional car broker, ends up having a request from a friend of his just to find like the most interesting car he could buy sometime in the mid-90s. And this guy, with a brilliant stroke of creativity, says, buy this hammer. That guy does, owns it for a little over a decade, and eventually decides he wants to sell it. And the first person he mentions it to is his friend, the car guy. And he says, well, I'll just buy it from you. So about 15 years ago, the current owner, the seller on MB Market, buys the car. Honestly, just parks it. Now that is the thing to me, as somebody who has documented rare cars, caused them to go up in value, irresponsibly, as many would say, miled them up, driven them a lot, is the thing that's always kind of concerned me a little bit about the ultimate upside of the hammers, because everybody who has one doesn't drive it. And it's an issue for a couple of reasons. One is that they are very finicky cars. The process of like bringing one back to life, the fuel systems are crazy, the heads are porous and they just leak inherently. They were built at the ragged edge of what was possible in the 1980s. That's how you make the world's fastest car. However, it makes them a little bit of a liability. So there's only a handful of proper experts that know how to rehabilitate and properly get one of these things back on the road and then actually drive it. Different experts like this have looked at the car. Some of them are bidding against me at the moment, hopefully unsuccessfully. Obviously, John and his team at Curated down in Miami, they've done several AMG cars, including a Hammer, and they're interested. Hopefully, again, not as aggressively as I'd like to be, but regardless, like, this is the first time that one is sold since they were worth less than 100 grand. Now, nobody really knows what a Hammer is worth today, and that's why the auction was so interesting, obviously, because there was one that was sold, it was the wrong engine, it wasn't even really a Hammer. RM sold it as a Hammer, it didn't run, it brings 100 grand, like that's not even, it's not a comp. There are no comps. There are rumors of some of these cars, both in the US and abroad, tickling 7 figures. And I saw this thing, I said, well, I'm not buying $1 million E-Class. I can't even believe I live in a world where there is $1 million E-Class. But that being said, at some number, I gotta have it. So when this car was built on a new car, so a new car goes to AMG, and the total value of the car, at least on MSRP and plus whatever options would have been stuck on it, was almost $188,000. And most of that, the $40,000 for the engine, obviously was the focus of the build. It was built by somebody who wanted an AMG to drive. You'll see some of these things with extra sound systems and TV screens and obviously body kits and spoilers and things like that, different options for wheels. And again, that's a little bit where the confusion comes from in terms of what is a Hammer. And when I survey the market of like cars that have upside potential, now this whole inflationary crazy, maybe it's a downturn world notwithstanding, like rarity is key and legendary status is key. And documentation is key. Now, documentation is the weakness here because they kind of just threw stuff on cars and they didn't necessarily keep good records, and nobody's done a great job of curating the history of these legendary automobiles. And so as soon as somebody does that, and again, it's pretty low-hanging fruit. It was like, you know, when I started the manual LP640 list, I thought there were 23 cars. That's how many I could find. Eventually we found 22 coupes and 10 roadsters, but that took years and years. Nobody's expecting 40 more North American AMG Hammers to come falling out of the woodwork. And there's enough other cars to maintain the excitement. Like in the same way that regular Murcielagos are awesome, manual LP640s are the ultimate ones, even better than SVs to those that argue the contrary. But I am really, really excited, and I've told several people this over the years, like, why haven't you guys all come together and written a declaration of rarity, all the VINs of all the cars, and then everybody who matters in that community sign off on it, and obviously make the list on VINwiki, and that's how you make them double in value. So Hartmut, who is the founder of Rentec, was the technician that built all these cars at AMG Chicago. And so he maintains sort of at least the most amazing memory bank of which cars he remembers wrenching on. And obviously they contacted him from MB Market, they talked to Hartmut, they said he did remember this car, he remembers most of them, and you know, certainly it is as authenticated as one would have to be to justify the value. Because again, the cars are so rare that they don't transact incrementally. It's not as though one sold for 200 grand, then 500 grand, then 800 grand, then $1 million, all you know, in public Amelia Island auctions or anything like that. No, it's these rumored, you know, way off market deals that may or may not have ever happened, but this is the first time that one is going to publicly, fully documented sell. When Ryan tells me about the car, I'm like, well, darn it, not to insult your burgeoning new auction platform that doesn't require anything towed to get to it, I am very interested in becoming the next owner of this car. And so at the moment, I am the high bidder, I will say. I don't know that I'll remain that way, but I am at least fascinated to have found what I think, again, is the car with the greatest 80s supercar history, the Cocaine Hammer. We love the team at Patrick Adair Designs because they make rings and other jewelry out of some of the most amazing and interesting materials on Earth and even occasionally from space. But they've honestly outdone themselves with their latest creation. They have made a series of rings using the aluminum that they cut out of an OEM wheel for a Bugatti Veyron. Obviously, I love the Bugatti Veyron, maybe one day, I hope, but they've also used forged carbon fiber, gold, and platinum to accent the rings however you want them. And honestly, as cool as the rings are, I think I like the case they come in even better. They have replicated the W16 engine on the top out of sterling silver. It's a cherry wood box with like carbon fiber and titanium screws. Super duper cool. So check it out now at the link in the description below to get yourself a super cool ring from a great company, Patrick Adair Designs. And if you order now during the month of July, you'll also get free at checkout either a carbon fiber ring or a tungsten pendant. So they've been a great supporter of VINwiki all these years, and they've created an awesome product here. So check it out now at the link in the description below.